debate, and the vote takes place tomorrow. We now move on to a report from our colleague Mr. Yar concerning the activities of the European Ombudsman in 2018. Let me remind you that as we have the electronic system, you can use that if you wish to apply for a blue card. To begin this discussion, we will hear from the rapporteur, Peter Yar, for 4 minutes.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President. This week, we've had a lot of debates about the European institutions, the fact that they need to come closer to our European citizens. We want to set up a European Convention in order to make sure that our fellow citizens can help decide how the EU should develop in future, how we should work in future. Democratization and transparency are the two hashtags here. Colleagues, that said, we shouldn't, of course, forget in this regard the European Ombudsman, because the European Ombudsman is an institution that is very close to the citizens, as it happens. You can hardly be any closer to the citizens than the European Ombudsman, I would say. And through this European Ombudsman, I mean, you're able to get in touch with this Ombudsman directly, you can write to them, you can even meet with them, come very close indeed. And therefore, I think it's important to take note of the fact that the European Ombudsman is there for our citizens, not for Council, not for the Commission, not for the European Parliament, but for the citizens. So the European Ombudsman, in other words, is, of course, an office that is often mentioned in the same breath as Commission, Council, Parliament. Of course, we have to work together, and I would like to take this opportunity to really commend Mrs. Emily O'Reilly on the work that she has done. I know that there's a certain tension that she has to resolve there between the different parties, whilst at the same time making sure that the interests of our citizens are fully respected. That's what it's all about. We're talking about the quality of the administration of the EU, the way in which citizens actually come into contact with EU institutions, making sure that that relationship is improved upon. And I would like to particularly commend Mrs. O'Reilly on her transparency, the transparency in her work, the way in which she has really lent support to the European Parliament. That's one thing. When it comes to Council, however, I don't think that's been quite as successful, but certainly there's been transparency in terms of documents, access to documents, Council documents. I think it would be really, really important to have a better access, and I think that the European Parliament could well lead the way and lead by example vis-à-vis the Council. I mean, we do it, we provide access to our documents, Council should do the same, I think. As for the legislative procedure of the European Union, we need to make sure that we're more accountable to the European public, and we also need to make sure that all of this is brought closer to the citizenry. And we would like to make sure that information is provided freely regarding decisions in Council, not just through diplomatic channels, but really making sure that we have a system that is fit for purpose in terms of our parliamentary democracy here. We've had a good cooperation also with the shadows on this report, and I think at the end of the day we've come up with a good report that we can table before the House. It's been depoliticised, if I may put it that way. We've actually enjoyed broad support for this report, and that's how it came before the Petitions Committee. 28 votes in favour, 1 against and 1 abstention. So that's a pretty good rate of approval within the Petitions Committee itself. And I think that's a good omen, and I think it goes to show that we've had good cooperation between the Petitions Committee on the one hand and the European Ombudsman on the other. That's been the case so far, and I hope it will continue this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yar. We'll now hear from the Ombudsman, Mrs. O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, everybody, and thank you to Mr. Yar and to the shadow rapporteurs for your work on this report. It is always a great pleasure to present the annual reports of my office to Parliament. However, this year is particularly significant as I am presenting our work to a new Parliament with many new members, and which 4 weeks ago voted confidence in me and in that work by electing me for a second mandate. I am very grateful for that trust and I intend fully to live up to it. I also very much welcome the presence of Commissioner Šefčovič at this debate, which comes at the very beginning of this Commission's mandate, and I wish it well in the vital work it does for everyone in Europe and also for many beyond our borders. Honourable members, as Ombudsman, I am the bridge between citizens and the EU administration when problems arise and complaints are made. The complaints come from individuals, from civil society organisations, businesses, journalists, and often from members of this Parliament. We apply not only EU law in our analysis, but also the principles of good administration, seeking a just outcome for citizens who are often overwhelmed by the, at times, technocratic nature and distance of the EU administration. We are not advocates, but we try to create a balanced playing field between the often powerless complainant and the very powerful institutions. The year 2018 saw a strong increase in complaints that fall within my mandate, and this continued in 2019. This is not because the EU administration lowered its standards, but because many more people became aware of the work of my office and what it has achieved and can achieve. I am grateful to the EU institutions, agencies and bodies for their cooperation in this work. The vast majority of cases are dealt with through a strong, collaborative engagement with the administration, and it is important to acknowledge that. Yes, I highlight problems because that is my job, but I also witness all of the good work of EU officials and have indeed publicly and tangibly acknowledged it through an award scheme introduced to showcase and praise their work and to share good practice throughout the administration. As in previous years, accountability and transparency related inquiries made up the highest proportion of my office's work. In 2018, I also used one of the Ombudsman's infrequently used powers, that of submitting a special report to the European Parliament. This was only the second time I had done so since my first election as Ombudsman. In 2013, I told Parliament that this power should be used very rarely and only in particularly serious cases where an institution does not act upon Ombudsman recommendations. That special report concerned an inquiry into the accountability of the Council of the EU, notably through the lack of transparency of the legislative processes used for discussing and amending draft EU legislation. The public has a right to know how their governments contribute to shaping that EU legislation. Without that right being exercised, the blame Brussels culture will continue, with national ministers obscuring their own role in the making of laws that affect their citizens. I was very grateful to receive the overwhelming support of the plenary for my proposals. While these recommendations have met some resistance from larger member states, I welcome the growing coalition of governments in Council that have publicly expressed support for such changes. At the moment, it is 10 member states, and I hope that the current presidency and the following German presidency will take up this issue of importance to European democracy and indeed legitimacy. As the European Ombudsman, I also coordinate the European Network of Ombudsmen, which consists of 96 offices in 36 European countries, with the European Parliament's Committee on Petitions also being a member. The 2018 annual conference took place in April in the European Parliament in Brussels, with Michel Barnier as keynote speaker, and I am very grateful for the highly professional support of Parliament in helping us make the event such a success. Honourable members, at the start of the Ombudsman's new 5-year mandate, it is important to ask and to examine what role it should play within the architecture of the EU in 2020 and beyond. If the von der Leyen Commission is going to be the geopolitical Commission and become more involved in migration issues, foreign policy, defence cooperation and in tackling the global climate crisis alongside several EU agencies, then who will provide oversight of this work? This Parliament will provide the democratic oversight, of course, and the Ombudsman must also provide oversight of an EU administration which arguably is more directly hands-on and on the ground than ever before. Whether it is Frontex coordinating forced return flights for migrants, or EASO interviewing asylum seekers in the Greek islands, or the European Defence Agency trying to envisage the technology required for a 21st century battlefield. The EU is changing, and so the Ombudsman must also adapt in order to keep pace with that change. However, the reality is that the office consists of fewer than 70 posts. We are receiving record numbers of complaints and dealing with more and more complex cases. The lack of resources of my office has already been recognised by Parliament in the annual budgetary process and in the ongoing revision of the Ombudsman Statute. However, I do ask that this issue is discussed further and in a more comprehensive way, and especially with the Commission and Council, and I hope we can find an agreed way forward. It is in the interest of all of us that the Ombudsman's Office is fully equipped and resourced for the 21st century. We must be able to fulfil our role under the EU treaties, in line with the expectations of European citizens and in this new geopolitical world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. O'Reilly. Now, on behalf of the Commission, we'll hear from Commissioner Šefčovič.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, honourable members of the European Parliament, Madam Ombudsman. I'm very pleased to be here tonight and to have the opportunity to discuss with you the annual report of the activities of the European Ombudsman in 2018 and the report of the Committee on Petitions. Let me start by congratulating the rapporteur, Mr. Peter Jaar, the coordinators of the Petty Committee and its members that have been involved in this valuable work. As every year, this report provides all EU institutions, agencies, bodies and offices with the views of the Parliament on the issues that it considers as being noteworthy and important. As far as the Commission is concerned, I would like to assure you that the Commission is very much committed to ensuring good administration in our relations with the citizens, associations and businesses with whom we interact. This is a fundamental part of our work, and we attach great importance to the quality of these relations. The Commission is indeed dedicated to the values of service, independence, responsibility, accountability, efficiency and transparency. And it strives to put the citizens' right to the good administration into practice and to avoid instances of maladministration. The cooperation with the European Ombudsman is a key in this respect, especially as around two-thirds of European Ombudsman inquiries, namely 58.2% or 285 inquiries in 2018, concerned the European Commission. We are indeed the institution with the most direct administrative dealings with the citizens. Every year, the Commission agrees with around three-quarters of the European Ombudsman's proposals, be they proposals for a solution, suggestions for improvement or recommendations. Thus, in most cases where the Ombudsman issues recommendations, proposals for a solution or suggestions for improvement, the Commission and the Ombudsman agree in the end. This explains why, at the end of the day, only around 6% of the inquiries end with finding of maladministration. In other words, the Ombudsman, after diligent inquiries, in an overwhelming majority of cases, closes complaints with no conclusions of maladministration on the side of the Commission, either because there was indeed no instance of maladministration or because a satisfying outcome could be achieved. The Commission's high standards of good administration have been highlighted by the European Ombudsman, notably at the occasion of the European Ombudsman Award for Good Administration. In 2019, the Commission won the overall prize, which recognises initiatives having a visible and direct positive impact on the lives of people in Europe and beyond, for its work on reduction of plastics pollution and the awareness raising about single-use plastics. It also won several awards in different subcategories. The Commission is also aware that it has to continue to pave the way, assess, improve even more, and where necessary, correct its administrative practices. This is why the Commission will pursue the very constructive relationship it has built with Ombudsman over the years, first and foremost in the interest of the European citizens and other interested parties. Honourable Chair, I look forward to the debate tonight with the honourable members, and I already thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, Mr. Teres for 2 minutes.
Domnule comisar, doamnă O'Reilly.
Commissioner, Ms. O'Reilly, as Shadow Rapporteur, I can tell you that it's so easy to work an activity report when the person who drew it up has been extremely active and extremely professional in their work. As Shadow Rapporteur for the S&D on the activity of Ms. O'Reilly in 2018, I was impressed by the professionalism, the courage and the dedication of Ms. O'Reilly in her attempts to defend the interests of the EU citizens in their relations with various institutions, as indicated by her re-election as Ombudsman. Transparency, the accountability of European officials, the access to documents and information were fields in which Ms. O'Reilly has been extremely active and managed to come up with proper solutions. In this respect, we had proposals regarding a high level of transparency in all European institutions. Transparency is an essential component of the rule of law, and I request that the new Commission takes into account Ms. O'Reilly's proposals in this respect. Throughout 2018, Ms. O'Reilly proved courage and determination in front of the establishment, indicating that at the highest level of the Juncker Commission there were cases when the rules were severely breached on the election of Mr. Martin Selmayr. After the Romanian elections, as a parenthesis, something like this would have been labeled an act of corruption, and the people responsible would have been taken to court. I'm happy that today we have a commissioner here witnessing this debate, but various officials in the Commission lecture various member states about the rule of law and the anti-corruption struggle when they themselves break the rules, as the Juncker Commission did. I encourage Ms. O'Reilly to show the same courage and dedication in her entire activity meant to protect the interests of the EU citizens, and we, the members of the Petty Committee and members of this Parliament, we promise our support. Good job and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tehesh. Now for 2 minutes, Ms. Toom.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, Ombudsman Commissioner, I don't want to repeat what has been said before. I want to, but I don't have time, so I will not. We all know that Emily O'Reilly has done an excellent job, and of course congratulations on your re-election once more. But however, these elections have shown that there are some procedural problems. It will be our task in the Committee of Petitions to change or clarify the election procedure for the next term. It should be in line with the principles the Ombudsman stands for: clear, transparent and fair. There should be rules on campaigning, for as we all know, this campaign unfortunately was kind of dirty sometimes, and of course we need a very clear time frame, not to put these candidates who are acting according to the rules into a vulnerable position in comparison with others. After adoption of this report tomorrow, we also need a vision for the future. I agree with what was said by my colleague from EPP and from S&D, but I would like to highlight another thing. There are still things which have to be done regarding good administration in EU institutions, and the procedure behind Commission responses is one of them. When we send citizens' complaints about member states and possible infringements to the Commission asks the national authorities about this. They ask the possible infringer whether they are breaking the EU law, and the answer, of course, is always no. What is interesting, the Commission is normally satisfied with this answer, and we receive an answer from the Commission that there is no problem, no infringement, which means that we are not standing on the side of citizens who are complaining and who is in equal battle with European bureaucracy. This needs to be changed, and the same applies to EU pilot, when we can submit individual complaints about possible infringements. The process is not transparent, the documents of closed files are not openly available, and it's a big problem to get them. And I would like to see a more proactive and more transparent approach, and of course I'm looking forward to cooperate with the Ombudsman further and hopefully to solve this problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Toom. For 2 minutes, Mr. Le Breton. Thank you, President. I think the European Union can't give lessons about the rule of law. We violate the most basic rules of ethics. We see that with the ECB as is proven in the 2018 report. On page 9, the Ombudswoman speaks out against the way in which the Commission appointed the Secretary General, the German Martin Selmayr. She speaks out against 4 cases of maladministration, including the creation of an emergency to allow this to happen. I was right to point out the illegal nature of his appointment here and in the Legal Affairs Committee, but it took 16 months for me to be heard and for Selmayr to be gotten rid of. After this scandal, the Ombudsman asked for a detailed procedure to be established for the appointment of the Secretary General. Unfortunately, in her report she states that the Commission refused to establish such a procedure for the Secretary General. We still have this lack of transparency, therefore. On page 13 of the same report, she speaks out against the European Central Bank and the President, Mario Draghi, who she claims is part of a private group, the Group of 30, which brings together heads of central banks. Despite these complaints, Draghi was still part of the Group of 30. The Ombudsman said that this raises doubts about the independence of the European Central Bank vis-à-vis financial lobbies. The Ombudsman also, therefore, confirms what I've constantly spoken out about. The European Union is lacking in transparency and in ethics. Thank you, Mr. Le Breton, for 1 minute. Mr. Swatowski for 1 minute.
Madam O'Reilly, Mr. Commissioner, I would like to congratulate the Ombudsman upon her re-election, because this is perhaps the best confirmation of the quality of your work so far. Also, the report that you are presenting and submitting for 2018 is a very good proof of the quality of your work. ECR is supporting this report and approving it. But the beginning of a new term of office is a good moment to talk about the future. And I would like you to take a closer look at the lack of clarity and transparency during the so-called trialogues, because this procedure is becoming a caricature of what it should be. We see this in the context of our work on the mobility package, in which I had the pleasure to participate. We see a lack of transparency at the very beginning of creating and establishing European law. I'm convinced that the Ombudsman should look at this practice with great attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zlotowski. The next speaker for 1.5 minutes, Mr. Georgoulis.
Thank you, Mr. President. The most recent European elections once again demonstrated citizens' lack of trust in the European Union. It is therefore urgent that we decode the message that the people of Europe are sending us, and that we recognise that we need to try harder. Try harder in making the institutions fully accountable and transparent, so that we can effectively fight any instance of maladministration and guarantee the maintenance of the principles of the rule of law. That's the only way that all citizens can be won over and will come out in favour of European integration. It's not enough, therefore, to open the door so that people can follow. We need to shed full light on things. Finally, citizens need to become knowledgeable about and stakeholders in the process. So transparency isn't simply allowing citizens to become informed about what it all means. They need to be informed in an easy to understand way as to how they can participate effectively at every stage of the legislative process. We've got an ally in this battle, the Ombudsman, Emily O'Reilly, who once again has served her institution with the utmost dedication. Ladies and gentlemen of the Commission and the Council, please don't ignore her. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Georgoulis. And now for 1.5 minutes, I call Mr. Furore.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by congratulating Ombudsman O'Reilly for her re-election and the effective work she's carried out to promote sound administration. I'd just like to congratulate Mr. Jahr for the work he's carried out on his report, which I can by and large support, with the exception of the paragraph on the ECB, which in my opinion run directly counter to the protection of the principle of openness and transparency, which should be inherent in decision-making processes in the EU. Among the good parts of the text, though, I'd like to mention the recognition of the public right of access to EU documents as an inalienable right to be guaranteed to all citizens. It's a right that's strongly jeopardised today by Regulation 1049/2001, the provisions of which, dating back as they do almost 2 decades, don't reflect presently the present legal situation or the way that the institutions behave today. I'm therefore very much in line with the request that it be revised. Also, I like the passages which talk about the need to come up with much...
Mr. Furore, you still have some speaking time.
I ask you not to speak too quickly. There is a certain sort of speed limit in the House, because if the translators cannot follow you, it is not possible that the European citizens can follow in all languages what you say. Now you have to use the button again.
Okay.
I give you some extra time.
Okay.
So I'm very much in agreement with the request that it be revised. I also like those parts which talk about the need to adopt much tougher rules and higher model standards to prevent conflicts of interest and the so-called revolving doors in all the EU institutions, thus making sure that the duty to behave honestly is complied with. The von der Leyen Commission has the task to make sure that cases of maladministration, immoral behaviour and violations of the rules, which we have seen in the past in the Selmayr and Barroso cases, shouldn't occur ever again. What we need to do is change direction, and she can do this towards espousing high ethical standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Furore. We have specific speaking times before this House. There's no point in writing things down and then reading them out twice as fast as you should. We have Mrs. Avey, for instance, who was previously in this position and knows perfectly well what I'm talking about here. I don't know, maybe you could ask for advice here as to what is appropriate in terms of speaking time and how fast you should speak within that speaking time. Now, Mrs. Curtin-Darling, for a minute, please.
Very much, President. The EU Ombudsman plays a vital role in our European democracy, improving administration and ensuring the ethics of our institutions are upheld. And I was delighted to see Emily O'Reilly re-elected in December. Emily, you've been an exemplary case of somebody who's advocated for transparency and good governance. And at a time when many of us, or many of our countries, are questioning the EU, and on the eve of our departure, your work on opening the black box of decision-making is needed more than ever. This is my last speech in the European Parliament, representing my beautiful and diverse home region, the northeast of England. It's been an honour, it's been a privilege, and I hope at some point somebody else will sit in this seat representing my home. But in the meantime, we're going, and I'd like to thank my current staff, Paul Ago, Carla, Matt, Max and Malcolm, for their dedication and hard work during the most testing of times, and my previous staff as well. So from us, the British delegation in the Petitions Committee, all we have to say is good luck and good night. Thank you very much.
Vielen Dank, Frau.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mrs. Curtin-Darling. Thank you very much indeed, Mrs. Curtin-Darling. It's not usually my duty, but you were so moved just now. You said you came from the northeast of England. You were elected from that constituency. Now, I come from Gerling. We actually have a partner city, a twin city in your region, and therefore could I ask you please to pass on our best wishes? Thank you.
Für eine Minute, Herr.
And now for 1 minute, I call Mrs. Vedren.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you, President. Commissioner, Ombudsman, Madam, I would like to thank the rapporteur for his work. The confidence of our EU citizens, of course, hinges upon transparency, and we have seen progress in our institutions. In trade, for instance, we know that the European Commission now has to continue to publish negotiating documents, and Council will also make documents available. All of this is necessary and helpful, and the Council in particular should guarantee greater transparency in terms of its workings. We also need to put all of our energy into making sure that an agreement is reached as soon as possible on a common transparency register, one that would be legally binding and in which we have to declare our conflicts of interest. If we want to bring citizens closer to the EU institutions, then we will also be fighting against Euroscepticism, and that's precisely why we need to work harder together and really reinforce the work already done by the Ombudsman. She can rely on my support, certainly.
Vielen Dank, Frau.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Vedren. And now for 1.5 minutes, Mrs. Evi.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by, in my term, congratulating Ms. O'Reilly for her re-election. Her work has been greatly appreciated by this House. Just as we are impressed with the work carried out in 2018 as reflected in the report we're debating this evening. A report which, as we did last year, shows the need for a transparency register. Let's have that legally binding and mandatory so that we can get beyond the problems with lobbyists. We need to have stringent standards as far as lobbying is concerned to avoid conflicts of interest. Also, we need changes to make sure that all decision-making processes are indeed transparent and accountable. If Commissioner van der Leyen really wants to mark a sea change compared with the way the previous Commission behaved, then she would do well to accede to these requests. The only negative note in the Jahr report for me is the paragraph on the ECB. Contrary to what it says in the text, I believe that there should be a ban on them carrying out forums in camera, particularly when it's banks that are overseen directly by the ECB. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Avey. For a minute now, Mr. Adjus Saliba.
Firstly, I would like to congratulate Mrs. Emily O'Reilly for being re-elected as the European Ombudsman. This is a vote of confidence in her positive contribution to improving the accessibility to European citizens of the Ombudsman. I am happy that the European Ombudsman in the annual report has tackled a very important issue regarding the treatment of persons with disabilities under the EU's joint sickness insurance scheme. I also support the recommendation to the Commission to revise its provisions regarding this scheme to ensure compliance with the UN Convention for People with Disabilities. I also agree with her recommendation concerning more accessibility of the selection procedures of the EPSO for visually impaired candidates. We now need a timely introduction of assistive technologies for candidates during computer-based tests. Finally, before concluding, I would like to thank Judy, that was our coordinator in our committee. Thank you for all your good work and all your dedication. We will miss you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Agius Saliba. And now for a minute, Mr. Benifei.
The EP, in its annual report, can thank Emily O'Reilly once again and the whole of the Ombudsman's office for the tremendous job they've carried out. European citizens have found a valuable ally in the Ombudsman, who has fought for years to guarantee good administration in the European Union. transparency in decision-making, accessibility and quality in the services it provides to the people. I really wish her all the very best in her new term of office and would like to encourage her to continue to push her initiatives on improving the decision-making methods in the Council. And when we see these cases of maladministration, she speaks out, as she did with the case of Martin Selmayr as Secretary-General of the Commission. I'm proud to have worked with her to stop the shameful practice of people in the European Union working without pay. I want to make sure that these non-paid stagiaires are rewarded properly in the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Benifei. Catch the eye, Mr. Pospíšil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In conclusion of this debate, I would like to point out that I support the report and one particular article which may seem not so essential to the colleagues, however, is very important. That's Article 47, which sets out the conditions for the ombudsmen to work, such as impartiality, moral integrity, etc., something that some may consider to be just a formality. And now when we're witnessing an important debate in the Czech Republic, where the current president suggested to the role of ombudsman someone who'd been cooperating with the communist regime, with some prosecutors which sent, say, Mr. Milada Horáková to death. And I'm very happy to see that in Europe we insist not only on professional abilities but on personal integrity. That's so important. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pospíšil. Now, Mr. López Aguilar.
President Wieland, Vice President Šefčovič, Ombudsman O'Reilly, I use this speaking time to add my voice to the appreciation, the very meaning of the institution, ombudsman, ombudsperson, as some say, and particularly to congratulate you for your recent re-election by the plenary of this European Parliament. You have 5 years to go. It's an appreciation of your work, enhancing greater transparency and access to documents. Although the regulation is yet to be updated, the work has been blocked by the Council, despite the efforts developed by the LIBE Committee, which I chair. But there is also much work to do in order to make sure that conflicts of interests are no longer there, that revolving doors are out of the scene, that your inquiry on certain practices of certain industries, in particular pharmaceutical industries, are compliant with the UN Convention of Persons with Disabilities, and finally, that the Code of Good Administration is upgraded into a real European regulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. López Aguilar. That concludes the Catch the Eye part of the procedure. And now we shall call, but in reverse order, those who spoke at the beginning. First of all, Commissioner Šefčovič.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, honourable members, dear Madam O'Reilly. First, I really would like to thank honourable members for your statements and comments. And I think that Mr. Terry has just started what was, as I have seen it, universal high praise for the great work done by Madam O'Reilly, which we in the Commission fully share. To Madam Thoma, I just would like to tell and to reassure her that if it comes to infringements and EU pilot procedures, I'm very much looking forward to our discussion in the Petty Committee, where I just got the invitation, where we can go into the more depth and discuss how we can improve our cooperation in this field as well. And I also would like to inform the honourable members of this House that on Tuesday the Commission appointed new Secretary General, fully following the procedure and I believe selecting highly competent and exemplary professional and good European Ilse Johansson, whom I'm sure would be excellent Secretary General. I would like also to add that The Commission clearly and constantly strives to ensure a very high level of good administration, and we are going to work with you in that regard to make sure that the right which is enshrined in Article 41 of the EU Charters of Fundamental Rights will be fully respected and enjoyed by our citizens. Therefore, citizens, companies and associations with whom we have the interaction fully expect that they will get the open, accessible and properly managed administration from our side in the European Commission. And I would like to also stress the fact that our daily exchanges with the Ombudsman help us to do it better every day, and that we jointly want to provide citizens with very high administrative standards, which are based on the principle of non-discrimination, courtesy, impartiality and consistency, few of the points you also highlighted in your interventions. Your resolution and the report of the Committee on Petitions on the annual report on the activities of the European Ombudsman stress areas where our institutions do well and where they can improve. And I just really would like to promise you that in the coming weeks the Commission will examine your resolution and will reply, as in the past, to all the issues which you raised and which concern the Commission. I would like to use also this opportunity to thank Madam Kirton Darling, Mr Corbett, whom I see there as well, and all the UK colleagues and friends for the dedication, for the hard work. I just want to thank you, and I want to tell you that we will miss you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Šefčovič. Is that a point of order? Point of order?
Thank you, Maroš. May I just speak? Maroš, thank you for everything that you did in terms of the Green New Deal and energy poverty. And I would just like to say that we would like a definition of energy poverty from you and your colleagues in this mandate. But seriously, thank you so much for everything that you did for vulnerable citizens. Thank you.
Frau Kollegin, das war
Thank you very much, Madam. It wasn't exactly a point of order, but nevertheless I decided not to interrupt you, notwithstanding that.
nun Frau O'Reilly.
And now I call Mrs O'Reilly.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr President, and thank you all. It's very inspiring to listen to the support and indeed the ideas that come from Parliament at this time, and I very much look forward to further discussions with you over the coming months and indeed years. Could I begin with Madam Curtin Darling? It's not often that an Irish person expresses sadness at seeing British people leave, but in this case I do want to say how sad we are, and also want to thank you for your wonderful cooperation and support with my office and with the Ombudsman institution generally over the last number of years. And I have to say I was particularly impressed over the last few months, in particular in the last year, when things must have been so stressful for all of you, the diligence and the integrity with which you continue to do your work and take an interest in things here, and even in this small office when there were so many bigger things clamouring for your attention. So I wish you all of the very best, and we will indeed miss you, and thank you. Thank you. Could I say, just taking up some of the points that were made, thank you, Mr Terres, for your comments, for your work and for your praise for my work and indeed the work of the colleagues. Madam Toom, I think thank you for taking note of issues that arose in relation to the election procedure, the rules of procedure. It won't be my problem in 5 years' time, but I think there is an important conversation to be had in relation to the election of the European Ombudsman. In relation to the case involving the appointment of the former Secretary General of the Commission, yes, the outgoing Commission, the last Commission, did reject the recommendation, but as Vice President Šefčovič has just noted, this time it was different, and the appointment of the new Secretary General has has been pretty much in line with the recommendations that we made in our investigation. Mr Zlotowski, yes, the trilogues, we have investigated that in the past. It's unfinished business and we shall be going back to see what is happening there. Mr Georgoulis, yes, citizens' participation is absolutely vital, and particularly for the legitimacy of the EU, and that underpins so much of the work that we do. I agree with Mr Furore, the right of access 1049 is an old regulation, but even short of revising it, I still think there is an awful lot we can do to have more recommendations accepted, more documents made accessible to the people whom we serve. Council transparency, yes, our big piece, work in progress, but I can see progress, and I note in particular that from an issue that was somewhat marginal and somewhat within the Brussels and Strasbourg bubble, it is now becoming more mainstream. Madam Evi, again, thank you for all your great support. Transparency, again, the ECB, all of these agencies and institutions, yes, we need to open them up to greater public scrutiny and to greater accountability. The comments in relation to disability, to assisted technology, yes, we certainly take them on board, and we take those particular issues particularly seriously. I was very pleased to see just last week the WEAS advertising for paid traineeships, and that arises out of the joint work of my office, and indeed with many people from the Parliament as well, led by Mr Benifei. So many ideas there, and thank you again for your support and for once again re-electing me and trusting me with this very important office. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mrs O'Reilly. Last word goes to the rapporteur, Mr Yar. 2 minutes.
Thank you. I spoke with Mrs O'Reilly in the Petitions Committee in summer, and we worked well together. You could think, could you say everything's fine in the EU? No. But what have we done together to achieve things? I would say we have done something. We should continue where we left off. Let's get down to it, roll up our sleeves. In the Petty Committee, we will support you in the upcoming work. Particularly, we want more transparency. There, we will try to shape that process. I regret the fact that Ms Curtin-Darling will leave the Petty Committee and Parliament. As the EPP coordinator, I wish there were more of your sort, and I think it was the wrong decision that was made in your country to leave this Parliament, but I hope that we will stay in contact. There are MEPs still on your side in this Parliament, and you don't have to end the contact. Now, as regards the report, it was passed by a big majority, so we need to continue that good work. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you very much, Mr Yar. That concludes the debate, and the vote, as you just mentioned, will take place tomorrow. In accordance with our order of business, we now move on to a Commission statement on the reform of the general principles of comitology. Once again, I would like to recall that you can ask for the possibility of speaking using the usual means as well as electronic means.